Welcome back to Bible 101. This is lesson 2 of 6 lessons. This lesson is titled Israel Becomes a People. It is the books in the Old Testament from Exodus through Judges. You might recall we left off with Genesis, where Joseph had gone down into Egypt, was sold as a slave to Egypt, rose to power, and eventually his whole family came down there. We pick up in Exodus now, and we find out that there is a king who rises up, known as Pharaoh, who does not know who Joseph is. But he does realize that there are a lot of Israelites living in his land. I would remind you, as you see in your book and on the screen, here is Egypt that he has been down into, circle with the red there. What he discovers is there's a lot of Israelites. An Israelite, remember, is a person who descended from Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. The Israelites are sometimes called Hebrews, and much later they're simply called Jews. So what Pharaoh, the king, did was enslaved these people to try to get some control over those folks, and even attempted to kill a lot of them off by killing off the children, the boys that were born to them. Well, one mother, in an attempt to save her son's life, put him in a basket and put him in the Nile River. He floated down the river, and Pharaoh's own daughter fished him out of the river and raised him up as her own. And she named him Moses. Well, Moses means draws out, because that's what she did. She drew him out of the river. So he was raised as an Egyptian, but his loyalty was still always to his own people. And we see that played out in one story in which Moses sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite. He comes to the defense of the Israelite and kills the Egyptian, buries his body in the sand, but finds out later actually the word about this has gotten out, and now his life is in jeopardy. So Moses ran for his life. He ran to Midian, as you see here on the map, pointing over to the Sinai Peninsula and where Midian is. And so he went over there and became a herder on Mount Sinai, or sometimes referred to as Mount Horeb. And he was herding sheep up there, or goats up there, and we read about this in Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So if you look on your timeline, you see this first picture here representing Moses before the burning bush, coming into the presence of God. Well, God calls him to go back to Egypt to lead his own people, the Israelites, out of slavery. And so he does that. He goes back to see Pharaoh and calls on Pharaoh to let the people go. Well, of course, Pharaoh was not interested in this. He has a great slave force. And so God decides he's going to help Pharaoh to decide. So God brought 10 plagues on the Egyptians. The 10 plagues, as you can see on your screen: water to blood, gnats, diseased livestock, hail, darkness, frogs, flies, boils, locusts, and death of the firstborn. And so God came through the land on this last plague and killed all of the firstborn in the land. But for the Israelites, he told them to paint blood over their doorposts, and when he would come through, their firstborn would not be killed. And so that's what they did. So God passed over them, and the children of Israel, the people of Israel, then were led out by Moses. Pharaoh finally relented and let them go, and so they went out. And so they celebrate this at Passover. At the Passover celebration, Israel would eat unleavened bread to remember that she had fled from Egypt in haste. And so that would be celebrated year after year for those folks. So they traveled throughout the Sinai Peninsula. Pharaoh has changed his mind. He's come out to attack the people, and they're trapped up against the Red Sea. And God tells Moses to raise his staff and the sea will part, so he does, and the Red Sea parts, and the people walk through on dry ground. Behind them, the army of Pharaoh tries to go through as well, but the waters collapse and they are all killed. And so you look there on your timeline, you can see Moses parting the Red Sea. And then they went out into the wilderness, and in that wilderness, God took care of the people of Israel. He gave them water from a rock when they needed that, and He gave them manna and quail to eat on a daily basis. So they were trusting in God, and God was taking care of them. And yet with all of that happening, some of them still grumbled. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to slavery. They were sort of like prisoners who've gotten out of prison, and they don't know how to live in this freedom. And so they want to go back to Egypt. And so some of them grumbled about this. Here's the map that you see here. And on Mount Sinai then, God gives them a law in the land. So on your book, on Mount Sinai, God gave Israel the law. And so you see this picture on your timeline of Him doing that. A significant part of the law is called the Ten Commandments. And again, if you look on your screen, you'll see these 10 commandments listed. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, and you shall not covet what belongs to your neighbor. But before God gave those commandments to the people of Israel, He made sure that they knew, before He ever expected anything out of them, that they knew He had already done something for them. We read this in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So this was an act of grace by God, that God extends grace and then people are called to respond. And we see this pattern throughout the Bible. God first extends grace, and then we are called to respond to that grace that God has given us. So God gave them this law upon the mountain, and they considered this a very good thing. We read this in the book of Deuteronomy. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to Him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? So this was considered an expression of love, that God loved His people enough that He would give them boundaries, that He would give them a law. It's really the same sort of thing that parents do with their children by giving them boundaries because they love their children. And so Israel thought this was a great thing, that God cared enough about her as a people, and that God had chosen her because she was not an important people, but God had chosen to love her and care for her anyway. We read this in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all of the peoples on the face of the earth to be His people, His treasured possession. And so it's from that verse that we get the title of this lesson, Israel Becomes a People, because God has chosen Israel to be a people. Well, as you can see on your screen, while Moses was on the mountain, the people of Israel made an idol that looked like a calf, and they began worshiping this idol. Moses came down from the mountain. He had the 2 tablets of stone with the 10 commandments, became very angry, threw those down, broke them. God became angry with the people and then punished them for their lack of faith. And then they had to get a couple of more new tablets for them to carry around. Well, while they were out there, God also gave them instructions about building a tabernacle. The tabernacle was this large tent where God resided in the midst of the people. And inside of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant that was kept in there. And inside of the Ark of the Covenant was some of the manna that they ate when they were out in the wilderness, as well as the 10 Commandments and Aaron's rod that budded up while they were out there. This was meant to represent the throne of God. It had 2 cherubim on the top of it. They were sort of like guardians, although God did not need a guardian, but they were sort of like guardians. And so you can see some pictures here on the screen of what these might have looked like, and you see the poles that were used to carry the ark because no one was supposed to touch the ark. On your screen, the Ark of the Covenant was in the most holy place of the tabernacle. And so here are a couple of pictures of the tabernacle that you can see. It's this tent that they have set up, and maybe an overview of it here. As you see, there is a veil or a curtain that divides the holy place from the most holy place. And in the most holy place is where the Ark of the Covenant would be kept. and where the high priest would go in once a year to make offerings for the people for their sin. So this is what took place in the tabernacle. It was important that they had this separation between them and God because God was holy and they were not. And so the sacrifices were meant to represent that this life of this animal had to be given for their sin. So they understood the seriousness of their sin. Well, on your screen, in the tabernacle, sacrifices were made to atone for the sin of the people. Okay, again on your screen, God eventually led the people of Israel to the land of Canaan to give them the land just as He promised them. He sent in 12 spies. You see here the picture. They go into Canaan. They send in 12 spies into Canaan to spy it out. They come back and they're all saying there are giants in this land, some really big people. And 10 of them say there is no way we can defeat these giants. And 2 of them, they realize that God brought us through the Red Sea and God brought us and took care of us in the wilderness. So God can conquer these folks because He's already beaten the Egyptians. But all the people listened to the 10 spies rather than the 2 spies. And so God would not allow them go into the land. In fact, He had them wander around out in the wilderness for more than 20 years until the older ones died. So because the people lacked faith, God caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until everyone over the age of 20 died. So they returned out into the wilderness, wandered, and then they went back. And again, they sent spies in. This time they sent them in to Jericho to spy out the land. They ended up hiding at the house of a woman named Rahab. She really believed that their God was great, was going to lead them to victory. So they said that they would protect her, and they did. And so we read about what God told Joshua, who is now leading the Israelites in place of Moses. This is what God told Joshua to do when they came to the city of Jericho. He said, "March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." And so that's just what they did. And so you see the timeline of the walls of Jericho, and the horn being blown, and people marching around the city so that they can defeat them there at Jericho. Now, it's not as though God didn't have a concern for the people living in the land. He very much had a concern for them. If you look all the way back in Genesis chapter 15, you find out that God said He was waiting for the sin of the people in that land to reach its fullness, as if they were going to pass this point of no return. And once they did that, then God said, then I'm going to eliminate them. But up till then, I'm going to wait for those people because God loves all people. And so He has waited for those folks, waited on those Canaanites. Well, the book of Joshua, as you see on your screen, the book of Joshua tells us about the land of Canaan being conquered. And again, you can see the map here. Now, we have a blow-up map of the area we've been talking about. And if you see that bigger body of water at the bottom, right above it is the city of Jericho. And you can see the separation of all the tribes of Israel and the places that they were going to live when they got into the land. So they come into the land, they come in at Jericho there, and they're told to destroy everyone in the land, to kill all of the people, because if you don't do that, those folks living there are eventually going to lead you astray. Well, they eliminated a lot of those folks, but they did not kill them all. And in fact, what God had said to them actually came true. They began following after the practices of the Canaanites living in the land and began worshiping idols just like those folks were doing. So the people of Israel were led away from God by the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. They turned to idols, just like the Canaanites were worshiping idols, and they worshiped them as well. And so the book of Judges then tells about the problems the Israelites had in Canaan because they continually followed idols. And they get into this cycle in the book of Judges. You can see it here on the screen from Judges chapter 3, but it actually happens throughout the whole book of Judges. This cycle that goes on all the way through here. So at the top, the people turn from God. Then the next move is that God judges by delivering the people to their enemies. Then the people turn back to God. Then God sends a judge to rescue the people, a period of peace under the judge, and then the people turn from God. And so this happens over and over in the book of Judges. A judge was a warrior who led the people in battle. That's what judges did, would bring justice for the people. One well-known judge was named Samson. Samson had his strength because his hair was long, and that gave strength to him. God made it happen that way. And there was a woman who kept trying to get the information out of him, what makes you so strong? But before that time, Samson was defeating the enemies of the Israelites, the Philistines, like crazy. There's this great story of Samson fighting with them. He picks up the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000 Philistines with it. Then there's this other story in which he takes foxes, 300 foxes, and ties them together tail to tail, sets them on fire in the fields of the Philistines and destroys the fields of the Philistines. But Delilah kept pressing Samson, kept pressing him. Are you going to tell me what makes you so strong? He finally gave in to her, told her, and while he was asleep, she cut his hair, and then the Philistines came in and they captured him. Well, then they poked out his eyes and put him in prison. He was in there for quite a while, but then his hair started growing back out. One day they brought him into their temple to make a mockery of him, and he asked to be set between two pillars, and they didn't know he had had his strength back. And he took and pushed on those two pillars, and he brought down the whole place. And so a lot of Philistines and Samson were killed. You can see about this on your timeline. Now we have the picture of Samson pushing over the pillars on the timeline there. So there are some lessons that we can learn from this series that goes through here. First, lessons about the Ten Commandments. There are really two aspects of the Ten Commandments if you look at them. The first is the people's relationship with God, and the second is the people's relationship with one another. So you saw those screens we had, and you had one part on one side and one part on the other. Later on, Jesus tells us that the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love others. And so these really end up mirroring the two commandments. He just sums those up. Second lesson, much like the sun is a life source to the planet, God is the source of life for us. So if we get too close to the sun, we will die. And in the same way, God is too holy for us to come into His presence. So when Moses wanted to see God, he was told that he would die if that happened. So the most holy place of the tabernacle was a way that Israel could have God in her presence and still respect His holiness. Well, that's the end of Lesson 2. Thank you for being with us.